the first thing I ever knew about my neighbor was the sound of his laugh. This was before I had seen him, before I knew his name, before any of the things that would later make his existence the central fact of my life. I had just moved into apartment 4C of the Hargrove building on a rainy Saturday in October, surrounded by boxes that all seemed to contain the wrong things, eating cold noodles on the floor because the table was still in pieces against the wall. The laugh came through the shared wall sometime around 9 in the evening. Not loud, the walls were thick enough for that, but present. A particular kind of laugh, warm, unguarded, the laugh of someone who is not performing amusement but actually caught by it. Someone on the phone, I gathered, from the one-sided murmur beneath the laughter. Someone who was happy, in the specific way of a person who has not yet been asked to be anything other than themselves this evening. I sat on my floor with my cold noodles and listened to that laugh move through the wall and felt, for the first time since arriving in this city 3 weeks ago, something close to comfort. I did not know his name yet. I did not know his face. I knew his laugh, and something in it, moving through the plaster and the silence of my first night alone in apartment 4C, made me feel less alone. That was the beginning, long before I should have said no, long before the night that changed everything. Before all of it, there was just a laugh through a wall, and a person eating cold noodles on a floor, and the strange, irrational sense of being, despite everything, in the right place. My name is Sam Reeves. I was 27 years old that October, newly arrived in Portland from a smaller city in Ohio, carrying the aftermath of a life that had quietly stopped fitting me the way lives sometimes do. I had a remote job in data analysis that paid well enough and required nothing of me emotionally, which was, at that time, precisely what I needed from my employment. I had left behind a social life I had outgrown, a lease I had been waiting for the courage to exit, and a version of myself that I had been wearing like an ill-fitting coat for long enough that I had almost forgotten what size I actually was. I was gay. I had been gay my entire life with varying degrees of acknowledgement and visibility depending on the year and the company. By 27, I was fully out to everyone who knew me, which in a new city meant no one yet, which meant I was starting from a clean, blank, slightly terrifying page. I was tired and hopeful and alone in apartment 4C, eating cold noodles, listening to my neighbor laugh. His name, I learned the following morning, was Kieran. He knocked on my door at 8 a.m. on Sunday with a carton of eggs and an expression of genuine welcome that I had not expected from a city I had been told was famously reserved. "I heard you moving in yesterday," he said. "I'm Kieran. For B, I thought you might not have groceries yet." He held up the eggs. "I can make breakfast if you have a pan. The building has thin walls and I heard you eating what sounded like sadness noodles at 9 p.m. I stared at him for a moment. He was tall, several inches taller than me, with dark brown hair that was doing several things at once, and warm amber eyes that were currently arranged in an expression of friendly, undemanding expectation. He was wearing a gray sweater, and had the slightly rumpled quality of someone who has been up for a while but not particularly concerned about it. "Sadness noodles," I said. "Cold takeout on a moving night, it's a specific category." He raised an eyebrow. "Do you have a pan?" I did have a pan. It was in the box labeled Kitchen MISC, which I had located the night before while looking for my phone charger. I let him in. He made eggs with the easy efficiency of someone entirely at home in a kitchen, any kitchen, not just his own, and we ate them on the floor because the table was still in pieces, and he did not remark on this, which I appreciated. He asked why I had moved to Portland. I told him the compressed version. New start, better fit, needed a change. He nodded like this required no further explanation. I asked what he did. He was a high school art teacher, had been for 4 years at a school 20 minutes away. He talked about it with the particular warmth of someone who has found, through some combination of luck and stubbornness, the thing they were actually meant to do. "The kids are exhausting and brilliant," he said. "Every year I think I know what I'm doing, and every year one of them shows me something that completely rearranges my understanding of the subject I've been teaching for 4 years." He said this with such uncomplicated affection that I felt something in my chest respond to it, the specific reaction of someone who recognizes genuine purpose in another person and is moved by it the way you are moved by beauty, involuntarily, and then with full awareness. He stayed for 2 hours. He helped me put together the table. He told me which grocery store was actually good versus which one looked good and wasn't. He recommended a running trail along the river and a coffee shop near the building that opened at 6 a.m. if I was an early person and 7 if I wasn't. When he left, he said, "Let me know if you need anything. 4B the wall between us isn't that thick." I closed my door and stood in my almost assembled apartment and understood, with the clarity of something you should probably not know this early, that I was in some degree of trouble. What I did not know about Kieran that first Sunday morning was that he was not single. This is not something that comes up over eggs on a moving in morning, and it would be unfair to him to say he concealed it. He simply hadn't mentioned it, the way you don't mention most of the furniture of your life to someone you've known for 2 hours. I found out 2 weeks later when I passed him in the hallway and he was on his phone, and the particular tone he was using, careful, slightly contracted, the tone of someone managing a difficult conversation, made me instinctively slow my pace. Not to eavesdrop, just the natural hesitation of someone who doesn't want to interrupt. "I'll be home when I'm home, Marcus," he said quietly. "I'm not doing this in the hallway." He looked up, saw me, and something moved across his face, not embarrassment, not quite. Something more complicated, a kind of weariness. He gave me a small nod and I moved on to the elevator. Marcus, a name that occupied my mind, without my permission, for the rest of the evening. Over the following weeks, the picture assembled itself in pieces. Kieran's partner, Marcus, worked long hours at a law firm and traveled frequently for work. He lived with Kieran in 4B, though I rarely saw him, a couple of times in the hallway, brief nods, the polite acknowledgement of neighbors who share a corridor but not a life. Marcus was handsome in the way of someone who has always been told they are handsome and has constructed their personality partly around that information. He moved through the building with the efficient preoccupation of someone whose mind is always already at the next appointment. He did not, as far as I could observe, make Kieran eggs on Sunday mornings. This was not my business. I told myself this repeatedly and with great conviction. Kieran and I had become, in the easy way of neighbors who are both naturally friendly and share a thin wall, something like friends. We had coffee together on weekend mornings when Marcus was traveling. We walked to the grocery store sometimes on Thursday evenings. He had given me a copy of his key to water his plants when he was away for a long weekend in November, and I had given him mine in return, and the small weight of his key on my keyring was something I was probably thinking about more than was reasonable. I was not naive about what I felt. I had not been naive about it since the second Sunday, when he had helped me hang a painting and stood close enough that I could smell his shampoo, and I had understood, with the clear-eyed resignation of someone who has navigated inconvenient feelings before, that this one was not going to be easy to manage. What made it manageable, what gave it a clean, clear border, was Marcus. As long as Marcus existed and Kieran was with Marcus, what I felt was a private matter, something to be acknowledged, filed, and not acted upon. I was very good at this. I had practiced it for years with various people in various impossible configurations, and I had always, ultimately, been able to hold the line. I held the line for 3 months. And then it was January, and Marcus left for a conference in Chicago, and Kieran knocked on my door at 11 p.m. in the middle of a storm with 2 glasses and a bottle of wine and said, "I need company tonight. Come to mine." And I should have said no. I did not say no. I told myself this was a reasonable decision. We were friends, neighbors. He needed company on a difficult night during a bad storm, and I was 2 doors down and available. There was nothing here that required management. I had managed for 3 months. One evening was not a line. One evening was just an evening. His apartment was the same layout as mine, mirrored, a fact that had always given me a slightly disorienting sense of familiarity when I entered it, like walking into a dream version of my own space. Same bones, different soul. His walls had paintings, mostly his students' work, hung with the same care you'd give a gallery. His bookshelves were organized in a way that suggested an organizing principle only he fully understood. The kitchen had herbs growing in the window, alive and specific, and the whole space smelled faintly of something warm and grounding that I had come to associate entirely and unhelpfully with him. He poured wine. We sat on his couch. The storm pressed against the windows in that comfortable way a storm does when you are inside and warm. He had music on low, the kind of instrumental playlist that exists in the background of conversations rather than demanding to be heard. He was quiet for a while in a way that was different from his usual quiet. Kieran was not an anxious person. He had the settled quality of someone who has done sufficient work on himself to recognize and name his own weather. But tonight his quiet had a troubled edge. "Do you want to talk about it?" I said, "or just not be alone in it?" He looked at me. "Both," he said, "if that's okay." "Of course." He was quiet for another moment. "Marcus and I are," he started again. "We have been something that is not quite right for a long time, and I have been trying to determine whether not quite right is something you work through or something you acknowledge and change." He looked at the storm. "I don't know the answer yet, but some days, most days lately, it feels less like something being worked through and more like something being held together with a specific kind of effort that is costing me more than I have." I listened. I did not offer opinions. It was not my place to offer opinions. "He's not a bad person," Kieran said. "I want to be clear about that. He's limited in a specific way. There are things he doesn't have room for, and I kept thinking if I needed less of those things, if I took up less space in that particular direction, we could work." He paused. "But you can't make yourself need less of the things you actually need. It doesn't hold." "No," I said quietly, "it doesn't." He looked at me with the expression he sometimes wore when I said something that landed somewhere specific. "How do you do it?" he asked. "Live alone. Not just not without a partner, but the actual alone part. The coming home to your own space and being okay with what's there." "I wasn't always okay with it," I said honestly. "There's a version of alone that's loneliness, and a version that's just presence, being with yourself. I spent a long time in the first version before I found my way to the second." "What changed?" I thought about it. I stopped waiting for someone else to make the silence comfortable, decided it could just be comfortable on its own. He was quiet, absorbing this. Outside, the storm moved through the city in long gray sheets. We talked for a long time. The wine was gone, and he made tea, and we talked about his students, specifically a boy in his junior class who had handed in a piece of work that week that had genuinely moved him, a charcoal portrait of his grandmother that had the specific quality of something made with love rather than technique. He talked about it with the unguarded enthusiasm he brought to anything related to his students' work, and I watched him become fully himself in the telling, and felt the familiar complicated thing turn over quietly in my chest. Around 1 in the morning, he said, "Don't go yet, please." Not dramatically. Not as anything other than exactly what it was, a person who didn't want the evening to end because the alternative was the storm and the empty apartment, and the weight of everything he had been carrying. "Just stay with me tonight," he said. "We can watch something, or just be here. I don't want to be alone in this apartment tonight." I should have said no. I knew with perfect clarity that the correct answer was, of course, get some sleep, you know where I am. I knew that staying was not a neutral act. I knew the difference between a friend sitting with a friend and what this specific evening, with its wine and its honesty, and the way he had been looking at me in the candlelight when the storm took the power briefly at 10:30. I knew the difference between those things. Okay, I said. Not because I didn't know better. Because in that moment, with the storm outside and the warmth of the apartment around us, and Kieran looking at me with an openness that he didn't usually allow himself, every argument for no felt smaller than the simple truth of yes. I want to be precise about what happened that night, because the story is not what it might sound like from the outside. We watched a film, something quiet, a documentary about ocean currents that neither of us had seen, and both of us found genuinely interesting. We talked through it in the way of people who can't fully suppress their responses, adding commentary and questions and occasional tangents that took us away from the screen for long minutes at a time. Around 3 in the morning, we both fell asleep on the couch. That was what the night was. And yet, it was also more than that. Not in what happened, but in what passed between us in the unguarded hours, the accumulated honesty of a long evening, the particular closeness of two people who have stopped performing anything and are simply present with each other, the warm reality of falling asleep near someone who feels like safety. I woke before he did, in the early gray of a storm-cleaned morning, with the specific, quiet clarity of someone who has slept deeply and is now looking directly at something they have been avoiding. I was in love with my neighbor. Not in the building, easy-to-say way. In the deep, inconvenient, fully arrived way that doesn't leave room for management or careful distance. In the way that had been accumulating since a laugh through a wall and a carton of eggs and a Sunday morning on a floor, building steadily through 3 months of thin walls and grocery stores and Thursday evenings and conversations that went too long and too deep to be filed under anything uncomplicated. And my neighbor was asleep beside me on his couch, in his apartment, with his partner's name and phone number on the kitchen corkboard. I sat with this knowledge for a long, honest moment. I did not do anything dramatic with it. I got up carefully, put on my shoes, wrote on a piece of paper on his kitchen counter, heading home. Thank you for last night. Call me when you're up, and let myself out quietly with the key he had given me in November. I went back to 4C, made coffee, and stood at my window watching the post-storm city come back to life. I had not crossed any line that could not be uncrossed. But I was standing at the edge of one, and the ground on my side was getting narrower. He texted at 10 that morning, "Thank you for staying. I needed that more than I knew." I replied, "Anytime." This was both the most honest and most complicated thing I could have said. The week that followed was different. Not dramatically, nothing visible had changed. No declaration had been made. Nothing had happened that could not be explained to any reasonable observer as two friendly neighbors having a late evening during a storm. But between us, in the specific frequency that exists below the observable, something had shifted. He texted more, not excessively, not in a way that announced itself as changed, but more. Funny observations about his students, links to things he thought I'd find interesting. At 11 on a Tuesday night, that junior student I told you about handed in another piece today. I genuinely don't know what to do with how good it is. Followed by a photo of the drawing. I responded to all of them. I was careful with my responses, warm, present, not more than what each message called for. I was very aware of what I was doing, which was walking a line I had set for myself, and that felt thinner every day. Marcus came back from Chicago on Friday. I passed them both in the hallway that evening, Kieran carrying Marcus's bag up from the lobby, Marcus on his phone, and the dynamic between them visible in the specific way of long-established patterns. Marcus not quite present, Kieran performing a welcome he was working to make feel natural. Their eyes met briefly as they passed me. Marcus gave the automatic nod of someone cataloging his environment without looking at it. Kieran gave me a different look, something quick and complicated, A flash of something that might have been embarrassment or apology or simply, I know. I went into 4C and closed the door and stood in my kitchen for a while. I understood, a limited number of choices, and none of them were without consequence. I could manage this the way I had always managed things. Hold the feeling, honor the line, wait for the season to change. Or I could admit to myself, if not yet to anyone else, that the season had already changed, and that managing something that has already shifted is not management but denial, and that denial has its own particular costs. I made dinner. I called my friend Nina in Ohio, who had known me since college and knew the full geography of my interior life, and talked around the situation without quite saying it. "You're doing the thing," Nina said. "What thing?" "The thing where you describe a complicated situation, using only its least complicated parts." I was quiet. "Is it the neighbor?" she asked. She had heard about Kieran in the way you hear about things that are mentioned too carefully not to be significant. "He has a partner," I said. "I know. You've mentioned that specifically every time you've mentioned him, which tells me something. It tells you I'm aware of the situation." "It tells me," Nina said, "that you're reminding yourself of it." I did not have a good response to this, because she was right, and the honest version of what reminding myself meant was, the reminder was getting harder to hear. February arrived with a specific cruelty, the month that follows the false optimism of January, the one that understands there is still a long way to go before anything warms. Kieran knocked on my door on a Saturday morning in the second week of the month. He had his coat on. He looked like someone who had been making a decision for several days and had arrived at the door before the decision was entirely complete. "Can we walk?" he said. We walked to the river trail. The city was cold and gray and mostly empty at 9 in the morning. We walked for a while before he said anything, and I let the silence be what it was, not comfortable exactly, but honest. The silence of two people who both know something is coming and are giving it the space to arrive at its own pace. "Marcus and I talked last night," he said finally. "Okay." I told him things I should have said a long time ago, about what's missing, about what I've been doing, taking up less space than I need to, fitting myself into a shape that isn't mine. He paused. He didn't take it well. Not badly, not unkindly. But he wasn't able to hear it the way I needed it to be heard. He turned it into a logistics problem, things we could fix on the surface. "What did you need him to hear?" Kieran was quiet for a long moment. The river moved slowly beside us, cold and flat. "That I have been lonely," he said, "inside this relationship for a long time. That being with someone who is present next to you but not quite with you is its own particular kind of alone. That I needed him to know that and to sit with that and to feel the weight of it." He looked at the water. He made a list of changes he could implement. I thought about that, the list, the gap between what was needed and what was offered. "What are you going to do?" I asked. He looked at me. The look was direct and complicated and held several things at once, and it was the look I had been careful for 4 months not to look at too long. "I don't know yet," he said. "I know that's not a satisfying answer. It's an honest one." "I know what I feel," he said carefully. "Some of it, the part that's about Marcus and that relationship and what it has and hasn't been, that part is becoming clearer." He paused. "Other parts are less easy to name or more complicated to act on." He looked away. "I don't want to name them out loud until I've dealt with the first part honestly. That doesn't seem fair to anyone." I understood exactly what he was saying. "That's right," I said. "Deal with the first part first." He looked at me again. Something in his expression, gratitude and something rawer underneath it. "Thank you for not making this harder than it is," he said. We walked back in the cold. At the building door, he held it open for me and we went upstairs, and at the fork in the corridor where his door was left and mine was right he said, "Sam." "Yeah." I'm sorry for all of it, for the shape this is in. Don't be sorry, I said. Just be honest with yourself first. He nodded. When a 4B, I went a 4C. I stood in my apartment and understood with the clear, ringing certainty of something finally fully acknowledged, that I was in love with him. Not as a problem, not as something to manage. Just as a fact. Clear and still and present, the way only fully admitted truths can be. It didn't make anything easier. It didn't resolve anything. But it was true. And true things, once fully acknowledged, at least have the grace of simplicity. March was the hardest month of my 27 years. Not because anything dramatic happened in it, because nothing did, because the situation existed in the suspended, agonizing state of something that has been named but not yet resolved, where everything is in motion underneath the surface and the surface itself remains, exhaustingly, unchanged. Kieran and Marcus continued to live in 4B. They were not happy. This was visible in the hallway, in the occasional sound through the shared wall, not arguments, nothing violent or loud, but the specific quality of two people who are no longer at ease in the same space. The silences that have weight, the conversations that stop just as they are getting to the thing that needs to be said. Kieran and I continued our friendship in the careful, bounded way that we had arrived at coffee, walks, texts, the ordinary routine of neighbors who are more than neighbors and both know it and neither is doing anything about it because doing something about it is not, yet, the right thing to do. I understood the rightness of this. It did not make it easier. There were evenings when I sat in 4C listening to the sounds from 4B through the thin wall, not specific sounds, just the ambient proof of habitation, of two lives in the same space, and felt the weight of everything that was contained in those 12 inches of plaster. The life that was on the other side of it, the man on the other side of it, and all the reasons why the wall was, right now, exactly where it needed to be. I called Nina on these evenings. Sometimes I said what was happening. Sometimes I just needed a voice on the other side of the line. "You're handling it well," she said once. "I'm not handling it," I said. "I'm just waiting for it to become something that can be handled." "That is handling it," Nina said. "That is the actual thing." On a Tuesday in the middle of March, I met Marcus in the elevator. He was coming home late from the office, briefcase, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been running hard for a long time and can't fully remember why. We nodded, rode in silence. At the 4th floor, as we both got out, he said, unprompted, looking straight ahead, "He's lucky to have someone in the building who looks out for him when I'm traveling." I said nothing. He went to 4B, I went to 4C. I sat with that sentence for a long time. The complexity of a person who, at some level, knew the geography of the situation and named it as gratitude. Who was, perhaps, more aware of the missing pieces in his own relationship than he showed. Who was, fundamentally, a person, not a villain, not a simple obstacle, but a person living in his own complicated truth. That mattered. That was something I had needed to understand fully. There were no villains in this. Only people doing their best with what they had, and sometimes the best of what we have is not enough for the people we're trying to love. It was the 22nd of March when things broke open. Not in the way of breaking things, in the way of a pressure that has been building and finally, inevitably, finds its release. I was home from a run late evening, the city dark outside my window, when I heard Kieran's door close, quietly, then footsteps in the corridor, then a long pause, then a knock on my door. I opened it. He was wearing his coat, as if he had just arrived or was just leaving, or had put it on because he needed its solidity around him. His expression was the clearest I had seen it in months. Not happy, not unhappy. Resolved. The specific expression of someone who has come through a decision and is now standing on its other side. "Marcus is leaving," he said. "Tonight. We decided together last night that it had run its course. He's taking what he needs and going to his colleague's apartment. He paused. We both cried, and then we were honest with each other in ways we should have been honest a long time ago, and then he packed a bag and called a car. I looked at him. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Yes," he said, and then no and also yes, both at once. "That sounds right. Can I come in?" He came in. I made tea. He sat at the table I had been given as a housewarming gift from him and his students, a small joke that had become a real thing, and we sat, and I let him talk, and he did. About what had been said the night before, about the specific grief of the end of a thing that had once been good, even if it had been a long time since it was. About the relief underneath the grief, which he named honestly, and without the guilt I might have expected, as someone who had processed the guilt already, who had been honest with himself about what was missing for long enough that the ending, when it came, arrived not as disaster but as something that had finally been allowed to be real. He talked for a long time. I listened. When the talking ran out, we sat in the quiet. "There's something else," he said eventually. "I know," I said. He looked at me. "I need you to know that I didn't let my relationship end because of you. I let it end because it needed to end. It had needed to end for a long time before I had the courage to say so." "I know that," I said, and I did. I had known it from February, from the river, from the way he had said, "I need to deal with the first part first." "But," he said slowly, "there is something that I have known and managed and filed in a very specific way since approximately late October." He looked at the table. "Since eggs on a Sunday morning, if I'm being precise." My heart was very still. "I have been careful," he said, "because being anything other than careful wasn't right. Not then. Not while I was in something that wasn't resolved. I couldn't offer something real while I was still, while there was someone else." He looked up. "But there's no one else now, and I'm sitting in your apartment at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I need you to know something true." "Tell me," I said. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine. "I have been in love with you," he said quietly, "since a very inconvenient and poorly timed moment in November when you helped me water my plants and made a terrible joke about succulents, and I realized I was in serious trouble. The table, the tea, the quiet apartment, the city outside." I turned my hand over under his. "I knew since October," I said. "Since eggs, since you used the phrase sadness noodles with complete seriousness." He laughed, the laugh from through the wall, the first thing I had ever known about him. Warm, unguarded, caught by something genuine. "I should have said no," I said. "That night of the storm, I knew then." "You were right to say yes," he said. "Nothing happened that shouldn't have. And I needed to know that someone could sit with me in an honest way without it costing them too much. I needed to know what that felt like." He paused. "You gave me that. It helped me understand what I was missing." I looked at him. The resolved, clear expression. The aftermath of the hardest kind of honesty and the particular dignity of someone who had done the hard thing without shortcuts. "What happens now?" I said. He looked at the table, our hands. "Nothing tonight," he said. Tonight is what it is. The end of something. It deserves to be honored as that." He looked up. "But I wanted you to know, so that tomorrow isn't another day of managing something that doesn't need managing anymore." "Okay," I said. "Okay," he said. I made more tea. We sat until midnight. He went back to 4B. I sat alone in 4C and felt the specific, bittersweet complexity of a night that was simultaneously an ending and the very early, tentative hint of a beginning. With all the grief of the first and the fragile, unformed hope of the second existing together in the same space, the way real things always do. April arrived the way it always does, with the slow, non-committal warmth of a season still making up its mind. The light changing daily in small increments too subtle to track individually but undeniable in accumulation. It had been 3 weeks since Marcus had gone. 3 weeks since the Tuesday night of tea and held hands and honest words. 3 weeks of a new kind of careful, not the careful of avoiding something, but the careful of two people who respect the weight of what they are beginning and don't want to rush it into a shape it hasn't naturally grown into yet. We were still neighbors, still coffee on weekend mornings, still the grocery store on Thursdays. But the texture was different, everything slightly more open, slightly less managed, the quality of two people who have both, finally, stopped protecting themselves from each other. He was grieving, in the clean and honest way of someone who allows grief its proper duration without dramatizing it or suppressing it. He talked about Marcus sometimes, about things he missed, about things he was glad to be free of, about the complicated human reality of a person who was not a villain and not a hero, but simply limited in the specific ways that had made the relationship unsustainable. He processed it out loud in pieces, and I listened without agenda. I was honest with him when he asked, and he asked directly, because directness was his nature, how I was navigating the situation. Carefully, I said, and less carefully than before. He smiled. What does that mean? It means I've stopped reminding myself of reasons to hold back. I looked at him. I was doing that for months. The reminders got less convincing. Why didn't you say anything? Because it wasn't the time. You were in something that needed resolution on its own terms. I wasn't willing to. I didn't want to be a reason. I wanted to be something that happened after the reasons were dealt with. He looked at me for a long moment. You are remarkable, he said, not romantically, just as a statement of fact. I'm ordinary, I said. I just try to do the right thing in the right order. Most people don't manage that. I almost didn't, the night of the storm. You did, he said. You said yes to staying with a friend who needed company, that's what it was. He paused. Everything after that you handled correctly, better than I did in some ways. I thought about the months between October and March. The management, the line, the careful holding of something that wanted to move. It was hard, I said. I won't pretend it wasn't. I know, he said. I know it was. I'm sorry for the shape it had to be in. Don't be sorry for it, I said. It needed to be that shape, so that when it changed cleanly. He held my gaze for a long moment. Sam, he said. Yeah. Can I take you somewhere? Not coffee on a Saturday. Somewhere that's more intentional than that. I looked at him. Yes, I said, you can. He took me to a restaurant along the river. Small, warm candles that weren't performative but simply functional. The kind of place that has been exactly itself for 20 years and has no interest in being anything else. We ate slowly, talked about things we had talked about before and things we hadn't. He told me about his family, his mother's stubborn optimism, his older brother who was an engineer in Seattle and called every Sunday with the dedication of someone who was raised to call and has never lost the habit. He asked about Ohio, about the life I had left there, about what I was building here in its place. I told him about the running, about the specific freedom of the early Saturday mornings, the long miles, the way the world looked at mile 9 when the body has surrendered its complaints and settled into something close to peace. That's what you look like sometimes, he said, when you're not thinking about anything in particular, like you've settled into something. What do I look like when I am thinking about something in particular? He considered, deliberate, like every thought is being evaluated before it's allowed. That's probably accurate. It's not a criticism, he said. I do it too, just differently. I paint it instead of thinking it. What does that mean? The things I can't quite think through directly, I draw instead. It's easier sometimes to understand something through shape and line than through words. He looked at his wine. I drew you once, in October, after the Sunday with the eggs. I looked at him. You don't have to be alarmed, he said. It was just a sketch. Your face while you were looking at one of the student paintings on my wall. There was something in your expression I wanted to understand. Did you? A little more later, he met my eyes. I understand it better now. We walked back along the river after. The April night was cold enough to see our breath and warm enough to be comfortable. The city lights reflected in the water. At some point, without planning it, or perhaps planning it in the way of things that have been approaching for a long time and finally simply arrive, we walked closer together, and his hand found mine in the casual, certain way that felt less like a gesture and more like the completion of something that had been happening for 6 months. We walked like that by the river, not talking much, the city going quietly about its business around us. At the building, at the elevator, at the fourth floor, at the fork in the corridor where left was his door and right was mine, we stopped. He looked at me. "I've wanted to do this," he said, "since November." He leaned forward and pressed his lips to my cheek, gentle, brief, warm, the specific tenderness of someone who understands that beginnings deserve to be slow. Then he stepped back, looked at me with his clear amber eyes and the expression I knew now, the one that was fully himself, no management, no performance. "Good night, Sam," he said. "Good night, Kieran." He went to 4B, I went to 4C. I stood in my apartment in the dark for a moment, not needing to turn on the lights right away. Just standing in the dark with the simplicity of something that had been complicated for a long time and was finally, blessedly, uncomplicated. Then I turned on the lights, made tea, texted Nina something happened. Her response came in seconds, finally. I laughed alone in my kitchen at 11 p.m., laughing at my phone with the kind of lightness that only comes when something you have been holding very carefully for a very long time is finally safe to set down. It is October again. Exactly 1 year since a laugh came through a wall, and a man I didn't know became, without either of us intending it, the person my life would reorganize around. Kieran is in 4B, I am in 4C. We have talked, casually and without urgency, about the adjacent logistics, the question of whether 2 apartments between 2 people who spend most of their time in both of them is an efficient arrangement. We have not resolved this question yet, but we have stopped approaching it as hypothetical. He is teaching his junior class this year a unit on portraiture. The student who drew the charcoal of his grandmother is a senior now, and has been accepted to an arts program that has made Kieran prouder than he would admit to the student's face, though I have heard the full extent of it in 4C on a Friday evening while he paced my kitchen describing the letter. Marcus as well. He and Kieran had coffee once, 2 months after everything, in the specific way of people who have known each other at close range for a long time and need a version of a proper ending. It was, Kieran said, sad and okay and necessary. Marcus had by then met someone who matched him better in the particular ways that things had not matched with Kieran. Kieran told me this without bitterness, with the genuine goodwill of someone who had processed the thing properly and arrived at the other side. I told Nina about all of it in pieces over many phone calls, and she said, "You did it right, the whole thing. You waited for it to be real and let it become real in the right order." I don't know if I did it right. I know I did my best, which is not always the same thing and is also the most that can be asked. What I know is this. I did not say no on the night of the storm, and the night of the storm was what it was: 2 friends, wine, a documentary about ocean currents, sleep on a couch. And it was also more than that, in the way that honest moments always carry more than their surface. I did not act on what it was more than. I held the line that needed holding, for as long as it needed holding, and I held it because it was right and not because it was easy. And then the line stopped needing to be held, and what had been on the other side of it came forward, and it was real in the way that only things earned through patience and honesty and the particular discipline of doing the right thing in the right order can be real. There is a laugh that comes through the shared wall sometimes in the evenings when Kieran is on the phone with his brother or his students or his mother. I have known that laugh for a year now. I know it in all its variations, the different registers, the specific cadence of caught amusement versus gentle warmth versus full, helpless, falling over delight. I know which things produce which version. I have cataloged them lovingly and without apology. And sometimes from 4C, I knock twice on the wall between us. And from 4B, he knocks twice back. And the wall is still there, 12 inches of plaster between two apartments in a city that is now, fully and without reservation, my home. The wall just carries something different now. It carries us. This morning, a Saturday in October, someone knocked on my door at 8 a.m. I was already up, coffee in hand, looking at the pale, non-committal quality of the light, recognizing it from a year ago, feeling the distance between that morning and this one with the particular pleasure of someone who can now see the full shape of a journey they once could not. I opened the door. Kieran was standing there with a carton of eggs and the expression of someone doing something for the specific pleasure of the echo. I thought, he said, that we might need breakfast. I looked at him, the dark hair doing several things at once, the amber eyes, the warm certainty of a person who has, through some combination of difficulty and honesty and the particular grace that comes from doing hard things in the right order, arrived at ease with himself and with this. With us. You already live here half the time, I said. The other half I live next door, he said. Today I'm the neighbor with eggs. I stepped back, let him in. He went to the kitchen with the ease of someone entirely at home, in this kitchen, in this apartment, in this year, in this version of his life, and I closed the door and followed him. Outside, October was doing what it does. Pale light and the smell of things ending, and the specific, unearned hope of something about to begin. Inside, someone who had walked into my life through a shared wall, and a carton of eggs was making breakfast in my kitchen. I should have said no once, and I didn't. Everything else I said yes to at exactly the right moment. That is the whole of it, every true word. This story is for everyone holding a line that needs holding, for everyone waiting for the right time in the right order, for the right reason, and for everyone who has ever heard a laugh through a wall and felt, without knowing why, that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The right moment always comes. Hold the line until it does. The end.
Hey guys, welcome to my YouTube channel Prism Heart Chronicles. Please subscribe to my channel for more videos.